G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Bloom. Today's special guest is Pete Smith, battlefield guide on the Western Front for Mclachlan Battlefield Tours. And he has joined us today to talk about the Battle of Flers in 1916 and just how bad the conditions really were. Hi Pete, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi Adam, nice to join you again. Yeah, great to be with you.
Nah, Pete, it's great to have you back on. And as I said, I wanted to get you back on to talk about the Battle of Flers because it means it's where you live, and it means I want to learn more about the Battle of Flers because I know the cost of the Battle of Flers. And so, Pete, can you just give us an overview in the lead up to Flers battle itself in November? What was happening on the Somme in 1916?
Okay, so I think what we need to do is to start with the Battle of the Somme. As we know, the Battle of the Somme started on the 1st of July 1916. It's a series of actions which slowly push the Germans off the ridges of the Somme, of which key to Australia is the fighting at Poitiers, which basically finishes on the 4th of August. Or thereabouts, I have to say, if you use a date and say the 4th of August, the Australians reached the high ground, took the windmill, and then the battle finished. Of course, that's not the case. The battle went on for months afterwards, but that part of the battle, and the Australians eventually will be withdrawn from the front line. So, continuing the Battle of the Somme, the next phase is the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Now, that is the battle that actually took, it's not what we're going to be talking about today, but it's the battle that actually took the village of Flers and the village of Courcelette. They are two villages, and in fact, Courcelette directly is in line with the windmill. Carry on down the main road to back home, then you will come to Courcelette, the next village. So it was taken by the Canadians. The New Zealanders and the British 41st Division took the Flers itself, and that was the 15th of September. The 15th of September is also a famous date because it's the first time that tanks will go into action. So it's the first use of tanks. And again, what it is, it's Haig's push to keep the momentum going before winter sets in. And he can see the winter, 15th of September, we're getting into colder weather, the weather's on the change, into the autumn. And he knows that he's got to keep it moving. So tanks committed when they really shouldn't have been. They were not ready, but they had their first outing was a successful outing. It's just that there were not enough of them, and they were not reliable. And in fact, the landscape that Australians will enter in the October the 21st, when they return to the Somme, is a landscape that will be covered with a smattering of knocked out tanks. So it's something that they will then, their first meeting with tanks is a meeting of ones in their landscape that have been taken out. The tanks are no longer going to be used because of the change of the weather. They will not be used in the winter of 1617. So where had the Australians been when the fighting finished and they are withdrawn from the line from Poitiers? They were moved across to behind Ypres. Into a quiet sector, and in fact behind the lines and just a little bit of line work, but they're licking their wounds is not quite the right term, but they are struggling because of manpower losses, their terrible losses, because you have to remember where they've been fighting. Of course, Fromelles for the 5th Division, the 1st and 2nd Divisions supported by the 4th, all at Poitiers, and all taking fairly heavy casualties. So all of the divisions that have been committed, the 3rd Division, of course, is not here. The 3rd Division is still being raised, or is being raised in the UK. So they're all being having reinforcements brought into them. They're being reorganised, and they're preparing for what they hoped would be back into action the following year. But that's not going to be the case. They're going to be moved across on the 21st of October. They will arrive on the Somme again. And I suspect that really, knowing they were going back to the Somme must have, and knowing that they're going to be holding the front line positions, and they're going to be used again in their final phases of the Somme battle, because the Somme does not really finish until the 18th of November. 18th of November is the end of the Battle of the Somme. So a long battle, and they are actually going to be used in the November. They will be used again in what you could honestly say are almost straightening the line operations. What they're trying to do is put us into good positions for the winter, because the winter, like it had always been in warfare prior to the First World War, the winter is a time of when things slow down. It gets too difficult in the winter to have any major actions, and certainly this newfangled weapon, the tank, cannot be used in the winter. It's going to just sink in the quagmire wherever it may be being used. So it's a quiet time. So that sets the scene. Australian troops moving back into positions that have only recently been captured. As I say, this village captured on the 15th of September, Flers itself. So the battle that we're going to be talking about, or the actions that we're going to be talking about, it isn't really just a battle. It's about the conditions and the state of the landscape and the state of the troops that have to hold that line and then be involved in these minor but very difficult actions in that winter of 1916-17.
So from the 21st of October, we're now moving into the attack itself on Flers village.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
can you tell our listeners, why was Flers so important to both sides, the Germans and the Allies?
Well, it wasn't. By the time the Australians have actually moved into these positions, they are already just slightly beyond Flers. So like a lot of these actions, they're named not because of the objective in this case. It's where the attack is coming from. So it's a straightening the front line behind the village of Flers, and that's all it is. It's a straightening the line action. So I need to talk a little bit about the German defences in this area. We have two very strong lines here around the village, and I would say that when we're talking about Flers, it is there are two villages that are crucial. It's Flers and another village called Gardecourt. And you will find Gardecourt being used for this action as much as Flers, the fighting around here. It's Flers, Gardecourt. Gardecourt is right on the front line, right literally on the front line, whereas Flers is just behind the front line. And what we basically have is rising ground taking us towards the town of Bapaume. And it's that rising ground that we're unhappy about, that the Germans are on that rising ground, and we need to really find ourselves in the best positions for that winter of 16-17. So it's about taking over these frontline positions. All of the divisions will end up here. They're going to be rotated in and out of the front line. So the 4 divisions that are available, they will all end up in this one area. And the frontage, just to give you an idea of the frontage, is about 4 kilometres. 4.5 kilometres is the frontage that they're going to be holding. So that's when they're brought in. They're brought in here to firstly to take over the frontline positions. And what they discover as they move in these, it's raining, it's wet, it's horrible, it's muddy, it's very sticky mud here. Very, I use my East Yorkshire dialect. It's very clarty. So it means cloying, sticky mud. It sticks to your boots. It makes it very difficult to move about. And they discover that the trenches are in a terrible state. They're in a very poor condition. They've got to re-sandbag, they've got to reinforce, they've got to sort the whole front line out. And they haven't got a lot of time because they want them to be used in the straightening the line opposition. The first attack will be on the 5th of November. So this is a series of operations. It's not one big battle. And that's the interesting thing about this whole thing. And I suppose why, to a certain extent, the Australian winter of 16-17 around this village is really forgotten about, because it is not one big battle. It's a series of pushes. And then it's about the terrible conditions that the men have to face in the winter of 16-17, which is going to be the worst winter for 40 years. So they're coming into the line not just on any average winter. This is a terribly cold and a miserable winter. So one of the things that we'll need to discuss, we'll talk about the battle in a little while, but where these guys kitted out, ready for a winter of such magnitude, and of course you know what the answer is going to be. No, they were not, and I'm not sure anybody was. No, the British Army, and I'll include all of the Empire forces in that, it has actually got the hang of clothing. It's getting the hang of layering. It's getting the hang of what to do, and how to aid soldiers. The problem with is you need to get all of that up to the front. If you're expecting soldiers to change into dry equipment, if you're expecting soldiers to put on another coat to try and layer up, then you need to get those supplies have to be coming to the front. And this is part of the problem here. The front line is very difficult to approach. It's very difficult to hold because you're overlooked by the Germans and the German guns. And so it meant movement is very difficult. So once you're in those trenches, you are stuck in them. And that's part of the problem. If you're in a semi-waterlogged trench where it may be coming up to your knees, I mean, well, I don't want to exaggerate these views that we have of guys standing there for 4 days, kind of up to the waist in water. Only an idiot would stand up to his waist in water for 4 days, and he'd probably feel frozen to death at the end of that. So that's not going to be quite what it was like. I mean, the men did the best they could to get themselves out of the wet and the mud. But no matter what, if it's raining and drizzly and miserable, it is the most appalling thing to face, as well as an enemy that's on higher ground than the sniping is going to be terrible throughout the whole winter because of the Germans having the slightly better positions. So it will not be a pleasant time for them. We'll talk a little bit more about what a soldier wears later on. I'm just kind of setting the scene and giving you an idea of. One of the things I want to mention is it's just worth talking about is the Australian War Memorial. Most people who have been there will be aware of the dioramas that they have at the War Memorial. The dioramas were created in an attempt to show to Australia, to the Australian public, what the battlefield had been like, what a battle was like, in fact. Maps are good, photographs are good. Being here is even better, but as we know, most Australians couldn't afford to travel to see the sites of where their relatives had fought, and in fact still can't. So the dioramas were created in an attempt to really give people an idea of what it had been like. But interestingly, there is a diorama of here, the front line at Flers and Gardecourt. There's a very good illustration. It's described as being to the left of Gardecourt. Well, to the left of Gardecourt is Flers, so it's right in line with us, up at the front line there. And it's not a battle scene. It's not a battle scene. It's a scene of men basically moving in and out of the line and the miserable conditions that they're having to face. And so it's an interesting diorama. Most of the other dioramas, there are a couple of exceptions, but most of the other dioramas are of attacks. They're of the landing at Anzac Cove. No, they are all of the charge at Beersheba. They are of the Australian memorable actions of the First World War. This is not an action. And it goes somewhere into showing how, at the time, most of the soldiers themselves remembered this as probably one of the worst times on the Western Front. We always think of the mud and the cold of Passchendaele and that period in 1970. But in fact, that's not what the soldiers remember. When they are remembering the mud and the real cold and the horror of the landscape, it's here. It's around this village. And that's very often forgotten, but not forgotten by Charles Bean, the instigator of the War Memorial, but certainly of the dioramas. And so he wanted to show people how terrible that winter had been. And so I think that puts it in its perspective, is that for the men that had fought, they wanted the public to know what they'd had to put up with in that first winter here on the Western Front, the conditions. So it's not just about the fighting; it's having to brave that terrible weather.
So we should mention, Pete, that it wasn't just the Allies that were facing these conditions. It was the Germans they were facing the same conditions as well.
Indeed, and as you will know, and certainly some of your listeners will be aware of, there's been some great changes taking place in military history in recent years, and one of them is that we now delve into the German archives, something that wasn't done for a long time because two reasons: we didn't know the German archive existed, and we have to spend some money on translating it from Gothic script German, Old German, into modern German, and then from modern German into English. So there are issues with gaining that information. But part of the things that we're learning are about the Germans and their experiences of the Western Front. And you're absolutely right, no difference. They are having exactly the same problems as us, apart from the fact they're on slightly rising ground. So it's better here for them, but only slightly. And something that is no surprise, and something I was going to talk about later, but I'll talk about now since you brought it up, and I think it's one of those interesting aspects. We knew that Germans were surrendering in every night almost into our lines. There were Germans dropping into our lines, holding up their hands and surrendering. These are guys that are not being captured. They're not being taken in trench raids. These are men that are coming from the German lines and dropping into our trenches and saying, "I've had enough. I just cannot cope with any more." For them, they possibly thought it was almost tantamount to suicide. And for our men, because of course, that's one of the issues, we are doing it as well. And it's one of those interesting aspects that as perhaps it should be no surprise, but there are certainly men from our own sides who were doing the same, who were out on standing patrols, perhaps out in the middle of no man's land, one or two at a time. And Jim turned around to Fred and said, "Fred, I can't stand any more of this. I'm freezing. No, I don't know if I'm going to make it till the morning. No, we've been tasked to be here. How about we just crawl over to the German lines, drop into the trenches and surrender?" But it's not as simple as that, because in a sense, because one didn't know what was going to happen. No, being shot out of hand was not uncommon. You have to say, in the First World War, being bayoneted was not uncommon. So these guys are actually in such a state that they're almost thinking, well, it's either suicide or it's let's just give it a go and try and surrender. And so we know that conditions were bad because we can see from the German records that that troops, Allied troops, were dropping into their lines and surrendering. And the same Germans dropping into our lines and doing exactly the same. So it gives you an insight into the conditions were equally as bad for both sides. Terrible.
Absolutely. It's so, Pete, we should mention, so who took part in the actions at Flers?
Yeah, so what we've got is, because we have several divisions here, they decided to use, they're rotating constantly. So there are two areas that we're going to attack. So let's talk about the action. So 5th of November, it's decided that there needs to be more pressure put on the Germans. We need to have a fairly substantive attack to try and push them back. For the 1st Division, who are going to be involved, they brought their 1st and 3rd Battalion was brought into the front line for an attack towards from just to the left of Gardecorps, and it's to take a position known as the Triangle. And for an attack going on further to the left at a location known as École Abbé. École Abbey. It used to be an abbey. It's an old abbey, now a farm. And it was the 26th, 27th, and 28th battalions are going to be used for that attack. And this is the 5th of November. It's a night attack, so it's the early morning, in what I can describe as the most atrocious conditions. Now, what was terrible for some of these battalions, they'd already been in the front line for 2 or 3 days already, some even longer. And so they were in a terrible state. And then at the end, to be asked to assault was, as you can imagine, almost seen as the last straw. But attack they will. And so they assaulted in the dawn of the 5th of November and basically didn't get to the German lines. Nobody got through the wire into the German trenches. They were cut down. The nearest people that got there were the bombers. The bombers managed to get to the edge of managed to get bombs into the German trenches, but it was a terrible disaster. The conditions were so appalling that the men started off kind of trying to move forward quickly, and then ended up with elephant's feet, with mud built up all around them, and were trying to move forward, carrying this enormous weight of mud on their boots. In fact, many men, against orders, cut off the bottom section of their greatcoats if they attacked with greatcoats on, which some did, some didn't. The greatcoats kept you warm, but they're heavy, they're waterlogged. But worse than that, they pick up mud on the bottom of your greatcoat. It picks up mud, and so you get extra weight. So you get almost a rim of clay on the bottom of their greatcoats. So they reduce the length of their greatcoats to try and save them a bit of that extra mud. Just terrible. Nobody got into the German lines anywhere. They're gunned down trying to get there. They're gunned down trying to get their wounded out of the line, and it became impossible to recover any of the dead. We're going to talk about that as we move into the talk, because it's towards the end of their time there, no dead are recovered. And in fact, it became very obvious to me when I started looking at researching and writing a book on this period, is that very few men have graves. There are limited numbers of men with graves here. Most that were recovered are recovered as unknown, but an awful lot are still in the fields around the village. And without labouring the point too much, human remains are very commonly ploughed up in this area. These are fragmentary human remains. So it's not uncommon at all.
So, Pete, given the heavy losses that occurred by 1916, what was the importance of the Somme Campaign, and also the importance of Flers itself? What was the overall cost to the Australians at Flers?
Yeah, well, ongoing. I'll use the one of the battalions that attacked on the 5th of November. They had 70 men dead in their battalion assault. Now, it's one of those odd things, isn't it? We often look at when we're talking about a terrible disaster, and you're thinking 70. Is that a great number? Well, it is, because that's dead. And what we normally think is that's a third of the men that will become casualties. And we never know really, unless you do very detailed research, how many of the men that's in that the full number are going to die within weeks or days. So to have 70 men dead means, they are looking at the 200 or 300 men had become casualties during that attack. And that's just one battalion. So the cost is compared to the fighting around Pozières or the fighting at Fromelles, it's not a great cost. But that's not the total issue here. Is because there are going to be other attacks. This is the 5th of November attack. They will basically be attempting the same thing again on the 14th of November. So this is right at the end of the Battle of the Somme, right at the end of that last attempt to drive the Germans a little bit further back. We now no longer are aiming to take Bapaume. That was the original target of the Somme, was to effectively, simplifying it, from Albert to Bapaume. We were supposed to take all of that within the first few days, and here we are on the end of November, and we are still not at Bapaume. So we are still in this landscape that we're not going to get out of. So what we're trying to do is do the best we can to hold what we've got, and to make sure that the Germans don't counterattack and try and force us back, and also mean that to try and avoid having so many casualties during the winter from sniping, from mortaring, etc. And that's the problem. We are not in a good position, and we are going to have an ongoing attrition rate. I started something that I know I haven't finished. I've just suddenly realised I was describing the defensive positions, and the lines that were here were the switch line. So I just need to talk about it. The switch line is on now behind our lines. It's on the Allied side of the village of Flers. Switch line had been taken, and then there's a line at the other end of the village, on the other side of the village, and just in between Garde-Corps and Flers, and that was called the Gerd line. GIRD. Very often, the soldiers in the war diaries, you'll see grid line, because they've thought it's been misspelled, but it actually was the Gerd line. It was still held partly by the Germans. To the left of this frontage, this 4-kilometre frontage, it is held by the Germans, or the Gerd support, the one behind it, is held by the Germans. So these are positions that the Germans were well built, and we wanted to get them out of those positions, really. And that's what some of this fighting was about, getting them out of the Gerd line, out of their support trenches, and pushing them a little bit further back. So the question that I'm trying to answer that you gave me, what are the figures like? I actually have no idea what the overall casualty rate is, but it's high, and it's high because of attrition. It's high because of sniping, mortaring, as well as these set attacks. But there's another issue, of course, and that is trench foot. So the casualties are going to be enormous. It's almost going to reach epidemic proportions of men with trench foot, frostbite, hypothermia, and all of those things associated with it. And so the trench foot is really going to become a big problem in that winter as well. So it's not just about the physical fighting just beyond our village. It's about that holding the line in these terrible conditions. And it's so, for those the people that know me that are listening, I'm an ex-Royal Marine, and I didn't ever see combat, but I saw an awful lot of digging trenches on the Brecon Beacons or around Dartmoor. So very cold and wet areas, beautiful in the summer. And being in a trench that's semi-waterlogged for days on end, it's mind-numbing. It is totally mind-numbing. And that mind-numbing aspect is something that we were taught at length to avoid, to do stuff to keep yourself occupied. You have to remember, these are civilian soldiers. These are not professional soldiers. These are guys that, yes, they volunteered, but you can imagine, did I volunteer for standing in a trench for 2 or 3 days? And the answer is, well, it was no. So this mind-numbing kind of just standing there and thinking, oh God, I'll just stand still, I won't do anything. Well, the issue with that is that if you're not going to do anything, you're just going to become almost zombie-like, then you won't just get trench foot. Because trench foot of 2 or 3 days of really little movement and little circulation, you will get trench foot, but you will not know you've got it because you're numb, you're cold, you're just waiting for it to end. But what you will eventually get is gangrene. And so gangrene was the next big issue here. Men were losing their legs. And I often think, what a terrible thing. Now, it was bad enough losing a limb, but you could go home as a perceived hero. I lost my leg at the Battle of so-and-so, so-and-so. These guys are going to have to go home and say, I lost my leg at Flers, it rotted off. Which is effectively what it's doing. Now, there was no glory in that. And it was a terrible time. And in fact, it became it was seen as an officer's issue, is that the officers were not doing enough to ensure that their men were massaging their feet, changing their socks. I have to say, not that either of those things are going to actually keep you warm or dry. You put your new dry sock on if you've got one, and it's going to be wet in 10 minutes. It's the physical act of massaging the feet. In fact, the guys were issued whale oil. They were issued whale oil to use as to massage their feet. And of course, these guys think, this magic stuff, this whale oil, it's doing a great job. It didn't do anything. It's the actual act of massage. Your feet are naturally waterproof. It's the act of massaging and rubbing the whale oil in that actually will save you from gangrene. I often think of how many whales had to die to supply whale oil to the British Army in 1916. But it apparently smelled terrible. It smelled absolutely appalling when you opened it. But yeah, so whale oil was what they were given. But it's getting the guys to do it. And I often think, that for those that recognise what a First World War soldier looks like, the things wrapped around his leg at the bottom, which I've heard called gaiters also, they're actually called puttees, an Indian word. Those puttees wrapped around their legs are a bugger to get on and off. They're an absolute swine, the time you have to spend to get them on and off. So you can imagine, bottom of a trench, soaking wet, and somebody's come along and said, change your socks and give your feet a bit of a massage. And he'd look down and think, no way am I doing that. I've got to sit down in this to do it, start off with. And there's no point. Well, the point was the massaging. That was the point. So difficult.
Because I did read somewhere, Pete, that the men's discipline of their own hygiene was pretty poor, actually, and in the end, it was very poor.
Yeah, I think it was. And again, it's because you've got a citizen army. It's been trained to fight. It's expected that the guys should be able to do these things themselves. And under normal circumstances, they will. But they have to be supervised quite closely sometimes until they get a hang of it. But in these conditions, you couldn't be supervised or with difficulty. So the men were expected to do it themselves, and they just weren't. I'll put it in perspective again. Almost first day, join the Royal Marines. One of the things we're shown to do is to wash your jocks and your socks, and the guys are shown how to do it, because it's amazing how many people. Mum's been doing it for me, and I have no idea what you have to do to wash all these things, and so again, so we're back to that. The guys, they know what they're supposed to do. They've been given the information, but the information in the early days was more to get them trained as soldiers, trained to fight. That was expected to be something that was almost natural, but as we know, for some people, it's not. So it was a problem. Yeah, it was a problem. Trench discipline was a problem. Full stop. There are some great photos of this period of officers massaging the men's feet. I think that's above and beyond the call of duty, personally. But they were. But that's because the officers realised that it was their problem. If the men weren't able to fight and they were at half strength, and you have to say the strength was always an issue. The number of men in the battalion should be 1,000, always less than that. But if you're losing men because they're getting trench foot, then and it's classed as a self-inflicted wound, No, because you can avoid it. So it was a self-inflicted wound. It involved normally field punishment number 2, stoppage of pay, basically. For the time that you were recovering from it, you're not going to be paid. There is another self-inflicted wound, but perhaps we won't talk about that one.
No.
And you couldn't get that in the trenches. Difficult to get in the trenches.
Best, I think,
yeah.
best leave that one alone.
So it was it was a hard thing to get a handle on, and it was in that way. I suppose it's a good thing, because they're going to move eventually to the winter of 17-18 and be around Passchendaele, where we have similar conditions, not quite as cold, certainly as wet and as boggy and terrible. And the guys are going to have the same problem there. So at least, again, you have to say the whole war is a massive learning curve. But at this point, it's not good. It isn't good. There are a lot of guys going down. I said it was an epidemic. It seriously got to epidemic levels of men going down with trench foot.
So Pete, we move on to, so obviously the 5th of November, they've gone in up to the 14th of November. So what's happening as we're getting after the 14th? What happens in the attack, and what are the Germans doing? Are they counter attacking, or what are they doing?
They don't need to, because the Germans have come to the realisation, and they did early on in that winter, they've been forced off their positions on the ridges around Pozières. So they're in the middle of the landscape between their 2 big defensive positions. One had been the ridges of the Somme. The second is the Hindenburg Line. And they're in this no man's land. No, it's a big no man's land, but it's a land that's not really fortified. It hadn't been fortified prior to the assault, the attack of the Battle of the Somme. So everything is ad hoc at the moment. They're building defences as they're being pushed back. So the Germans come to the realisation that they don't really want to attack any longer, because what they're going to do in the February of 1917, they're going to start pulling out and falling back in an organised withdrawal. It's a little bit like us leaving Gallipoli. In an organised withdrawal, quietly leaving the trenches, they're going to fall back to the Hindenburg Line. So for the Germans, there is no attacking. They're just holding the line and causing us terrible casualties, because we are not going to attack either, but we have to hold the line, and we need to keep them under pressure. We always felt it was since we were the aggressive nation now, in other words, the Germans are trying to hold on to what they've gained at this point in the war, we are seen to be the aggressive aggressive fighters trying to push the Germans back. So we wanted to control no man's land. So it was we patrolled, we raided the Germans, we put in listening positions, sniping positions, machine gun positions. We had fighting patrols going out, and all of this is being learned on the hoof for a lot of the Australian units that are here. It's the first time that they've had these opportunities to do all of this. So again, it's going to cause us terrible casualties, because we are out in the open when we're trying to control no man's land, and the Germans are quite happy to sit there while they're organising their withdrawal. And so for us, it's an ongoing nightmare. It's an ongoing tough time throughout the whole of that winter. But nobody really, after the 14th of November, the last attempt to move the Germans a little bit further back off the ridge, and it fails. It's holding the line, and it's at a terrible cost. And that's where the casualties rise and rise. And also, since everybody's here, everybody that has joined and is not being formed into the 3rd Division in England, so some are going straight to Britain to be formed into the 3rd Division, but those that are arriving on the Western Front, this is their first experience. So it's not a good place to move into the Western Front. But for the whole of that winter and beyond, Australians will remain in this area. And in fact, when we start following the Germans back to the Hindenburg Line, where do we end up? Well, we end up at Bulcourt, of course. So that's where our next set piece battle will be. We'll be at Bulcourt. And that is in a direct line of pushing the Germans back from here, from this village. We end up at Bulcourt, through Bapaume, out the other side. Some very famous stories connected with Bapaume and the delayed mine that blew the town hall up. Perhaps we'll save that for another day. So back to the positions here. So they just have to suffer in those conditions. Perhaps if you'll let me, what we'll quickly talk about is what an Australian soldier in this period is wearing. I mean, it may be interesting to your listeners as to what he's wearing.
Absolutely, Pete.
So we've got standard service boots, leather, studded at the bottom, hobnail boots. Great for chalky tracks, good for dry fields, not so good for cobblestones, and certainly not so good for standing in static water. They're not that waterproof. They're waterproof, but as any boots is, if it's over your ankles, then they're going to fill. They did have, as a trench supply, so in other words, you were given a limited number as you came into the line, trench waders. So big, almost thigh-length waders. There are stories of guys coming out of this front line here with no trousers on and no boots, because the only way they could get them out of the mud was for the guys to literally unbuckle their trousers and leave their trousers and their waders in the trench because they couldn't get out. So it gives you an idea of some of the conditions and the difficulty of the mud here. But let's go back to so boots, puttees, as we've discussed with the puttees. Very often men enhance the puttees by wrapping sandbags around their legs to try and give them extra warmth and also keep the mud off from getting onto the puttees. Because the difficulty is, if you're trying to take the puttees off to massage your feet and they're caked in mud, then it's even more difficult to get your puttees off. So put sandbags around the outside and you get a little bit more protection. Then we have their breeches, and of course at this period still a lot of the Australian soldiers are wearing the corduroy breeches. Those will slowly, as the war went on, be changed over to what the Australians knew as Tommy trousers. In other words, the British soldiers' trousers. With due reason, I've always felt. I mean, they are a sign of the Australian uniform. That longer tunic, I would call it a Norfolk jacket, but a longer tunic than what we are wearing. Corduroy breeches, very smart, looking cool. But the corduroy breeches are riding breeches. Why the hell is the infantry wearing riding breeches? Because effectively that's what they're wearing. And so it was slowly but surely they went over to the Tommy trousers, the standard British wear. But it's always bemoaned. Australians didn't like it. They liked it because they thought they were a lot smarter, as they were. You have to say they are. But corduroy breeches. So they got the corduroy breeches on. He's then got his undergarments on. He would have normally long johns. At this period, they would be issued with long johns in the winter. Not good, I have to say. Now, as an ex-Royal Marine commando, you'll know that term "going commando." Where you don't wear undergarments. Well, it's very true. We didn't wear undergarments when we were on any kind of exercise or anything, because if you're doing water crossings and you've just got your thin cotton trousers on, and we wore puttees at the period I'm talking about. I was still wearing puttees, the ankle puttees, but we had puttees. The wind dries them very quickly. The wind, it doesn't matter whether it's winter or summer, your body heat and a breeze will dry your trousers quite quickly. Not if you've got undies on, and certainly not if you've got long johns on. And we were issued them. We were issued long johns, but we just didn't wear them. We never wore. Well, fancy dress. I think it's the only time I ever wore my long johns. Fancy dress. So these guys, it's not going to help. It will keep you warm, but if you're wet, it's not a good thing. On top, they've got probably a vest of some description, and many of the guys who realised as the war went on bought silk undergarments because it's very light, very thin, and gave you another layer. So it might seem like a silly thing to do, but certainly was recognised. This layering was recognised. But a vest, then they're going to wear what's known as a greyback shirt, which is known as a hairy shirt, and then on top of that, tunic. Jumper, cardigan, sometimes a little cardigan, and then their tunic on top. And then on top of that, a greatcoat. The greatcoats were starting to be dropped for the leather jerkins. And you may have seen those also. Some Australians had these, but they weren't popular for a very obvious reason. These things that were made out of rabbit fur or goat fur. And they had the fur on the outside, which is kind of the thing. That's a strange concept. Why would you have the fur on the outside? I actually don't know, but I presume because it gave you an element of camouflage. If it was snowing and you had these white, because they were white, white, fair kind of, but I have no idea. I'll just go on to a little private story. My grandfather was a shoeing smith in the First World War, and he was issued, I've got a picture of him wearing one of those. It was taken in a photographic studio here in France. He never wore it in the line because he said the mules bolted. If you walked towards a mule wearing a fairy white jacket, they thought it was some kind of hybrid wolf thing. They didn't like it and they were off. But they had a leather tunic as well. They also had a waterproof sheet, their ponchos, effectively, that they put over everything. There was obviously an issue here, and that is, as you put more and more of this stuff on, it gets heavier and heavier. And you have to have a balance, and you still do. It's a very, very common thing. So what you have to decide is, yes, I want to be comfortable, but I've got to be able to move when I'm in the attack or on a raid. So how much do I wear? So it was always a balance. But if you're static in a trench, not doing anything, just holding the line, you need to be really wearing it as much as you possibly can. But it is difficult. The problem they have is when it was damaged, when it was waterlogged, it's not going to be changed. It's going to wait until you get out of the line. And getting out of the line was a long, protracted and difficult route back from the front line, through my village, onwards through to another village called Longueval, over the ridge to get to that village, and then you've got safety. So you've got almost for a fully laden soldier in the dark, you've probably got 6 or 7 hours to get out of the front line, marching in the mud. Now, the big issue was here is you couldn't remain in the trenches easily because they were waterlogged, and so most men went overground, and that's why it had to be done in the dark. But the Germans knew this, and they had guns firing on fixed positions, just sweeping across that landscape in the rear of us, and also artillery positions, firing into what they knew were places where men were crossing. And so getting off this landscape was difficult. Now, if it's difficult for the living, it was a nightmare for the wounded. The wounded had the most appalling time getting out of here. And we're talking about 6 to 8 men per stretcher to try and get a guy out of the front line here. It was truly a nightmare. And that is another thing that's well remembered here, is the difficulty of handling wounded men. Hence, we have this second one. If you were killed outright and you could be buried, you were buried where you fell here. Very similar to what will happen during the fighting at Passchendaele as well. So that's why, again, even for those that were recovered and buried at the time, their graves were eventually lost because very few are buried in organised trenches. Most of them are going to be buried where they fell. Now, hopefully, some of them grouped, and it's those groupings that very often are found after the war. Or, sadly, they're found in a period after the Germans had fallen back to the Hindenburg Line. That means in 1917, we have a good year when we can clear these battlefields. And a lot of guys were found during those clearances. And in fact, the 1st Battalion, who had fought here on the 5th of November, came back in the February-March of 1917 to recover their own dead. I often find that as very, I've been studying that just recently. It's very moving when you think these are guys that have died in November. They've been lying out in the open, and their comrades come back to find them, 3 months later, and to bury them. How difficult would that be? When you're trying to find guys who are your friends. But the 1st Battalion did that. They came back and buried their own dead. Sadly, of course, where they're burying them on the battlefield. And it's a battlefield that will become a battlefield again in 1918. And so their graves were lost again for a second time, or their bodies lost again. So that's why, again, many are missing. It's not because they were not buried properly. They were buried properly in that period in between the Germans coming again in their spring offensive and the graves being lost. Back to the uniforms. Sorry, going off on one of my famous tangents.
Oh, good, Pete. No, it's great. It gives the listeners a chance to just hear some stories that they wouldn't normally hear. So keep going, mate. Absolutely. I'm loving it.
So we've talked about what they're wearing on top. Because the thing we haven't talked about is what are they wearing on their heads? Well, of course they're wearing their helmets. Slouch hats now forbidden in the front line. It became a chargeable offence to take your slouch hat into the front line because the soldiers like to get comfy. The temptation is to remove your helmet, put your slouch hat on when you think nobody's looking. The big killer here, and will be for most of the war, well, for all of the war, is the artillery, and it's that air-bear shrapnel shell blowing out those lead or steel ball bearings. And the whiz-bang, faster than the speed of sound, no, you don't know it's coming. So you haven't got a chance to change from slouch hat to helmet. So it became a real killer if you didn't have your helmet on. Your helmet will save your life, so long as it doesn't detonate kind of above your head, so long as there's a bit of distance, then it can save your life. And so helmets became the order of the day. Of course, balaclavas, if you've got a balaclava, and there's women all over the empire knitting balaclavas, gloves and socks for the men, and they're arriving on the Western Front in enormous numbers. Then they were needed. I mean, it's kind of one of the semi-jokes, and everybody's knitting and creating socks. Surely, how many socks does a soldier need? Well, he needs a lot. And he needs them regularly to be replaced, and the military couldn't keep up with it. So those balaclavas and gloves and socks came in very handy for the men in the frontline positions in that winter. What else are they carrying? Well, of course, they're carrying their webbing, and the webbing is also it's webbing material, so it can be waterlogged. It gets waterlogged, so it also becomes heavier as time went on. It became heavy, and they're carrying their ammunition, and they're carrying their small packs into the line for that period when they're holding the front line. I have to say they relaxed the washing and shaving issues. It was so terrible that it was seen as, nah, if you're going to be there for well, normally 3 days, but it's been reduced to 2 days for this period. The weather was so bad. So 2 days in the front line, and you didn't have to worry about washing and shaving until you came out the line completely, and then that was the first thing you did. I often think, where were they going, and what did they think about it? Well, they're not going far. They're going over that ridge, and they're going to the old frontline positions of 1916. So the Byzantine woods, places just this side of Albert, and into a landscape that's still devastated. So they didn't leave at those periods when they're rotating out of the front line. They're not rotating into big rest areas a long way back. They're only going just where yes, they're building hutted camps in some of the woods, or the remnants of the woods. No way are they woods any longer, but they're building hutted camps, and the men are at least getting into the hutted camps. But it was a period when I can only describe it as soul destroying. No sign of the end of the war, so there's no yet any feeling that we're really doing any good here, that it's not progressing at any great speed. So nothing really to look forward to, other than hopefully eventually having a warmish bath, perhaps if I can get out far enough behind the lines, and the rest period. And I think that would have been so demoralising for the men, having those that had fought at Poitiers, those that had fought at Fromelles, to then have to spend that winter in the front line. Must have been tough. Even though they are being rotated, you have to remember they are being rotated. We do get this mental image of a guy going into the trench and spending the whole war in the front line trench, because it's only a fraction of his service is in the front line. But he needed to be in that winter. You couldn't spend more than 2 days in the front line.
Pete, there's some amazing stories and telling the listeners the conditions of just how terrible these men were fighting. So given all the conditions and the cost to the cost on both sides, do you believe, and in your opinion, Pete, do you believe the casualties and the losses of the Somme are justified? And do you think it was a Allied victory, the whole Somme campaign?
Yeah, I mean the losses on the Somme are enormous, and for Australia and all of the Commonwealth forces, this was their blooding. For most of them, New Zealanders who fought unbelievably well here and took my village. You'd have to say, if it wasn't for the New Zealanders, the village probably wouldn't have been held, because the 41st Division fell back, having took the village, and the 14th Division on their left never cleared a position known as High Wood. So the New Zealanders fought very hard to hold the whole front line during that initial attack on the 15th of September. Canadians obviously will go into action at Courcelette. So we're all good. South Africans, Delville Wood, they'd already been in action at Delville Wood, and Delville Wood just behind us. So everybody was here, and it sucked in most of, well, in fact, Newfoundland. We always associate Newfoundlanders as fighting at Beaumont Hamel, but they fought here as well. So just at Gardecourt, another of their caribous, their enormous bronze caribous, is just outside of Gardecourt. So they were here in this area as well. So enormous effort by the Empire forces to force the Germans off the ridges, which we did. So you have to say that's one success. We didn't get to our initial objective, which had been Bapaume. We don't get there. We only get there when the Germans fall back in spring. But you have to remember, and this is what's forgotten really, what is this all about? What is the Battle of the Somme about? Well, yes, we hoped for a breakthrough, and Haig was pushing hard to try and get us a breakthrough. But that isn't what the Battle of the Somme is about. The Battle of the Somme is trying to relieve the pressure of the French at Verdun, who are experiencing unbelievable casualties there. And they are concerned that if Verdun does fall, then the will of the French people to continue may evaporate. And so it was seen as crucial that the pressure was eased on the French. And so the Battle of the Somme was an attempt to draw in German reserves that would have been used at Verdun, and that was very successful. And it also freed up enormous numbers of Frenchmen to be shifted from these ridges that were held by the French prior to the Battle of the Somme to be transferred over to Verdun as well. So yeah, the Somme battle. You'd have to say is a success. Whether you believe it, the truly appalling casualty levels of all of the people that were involved in it are worth it, I think historians will discuss that for forever. My view would be, if the French had lost Verdun and the French had then started looking at capitulation, then the losses up to that point would have been pointless, because we would have evacuated if the French were. What's the point to continue? We can't hold them ourselves, and since we are there to support the French, so no, I think it was essential if the war is going to continue, and there is no option at this position. There is no option. The Germans have still got their tails up. They still are believing that they can force an amnesty, with the condition that they will keep what they've got, and that is what their aim is basically to hang on to what they've got. So the Battle of the Somme was essential, and but the losses truly appalling. And perhaps one of the things that, excuse me, is not remembered, I suppose, it should be, is that first use of tanks. That first use of tanks was important, but it gave the game away. It did seriously give the game away. And it was not what was wanted or what was expected by those that had been involved in the development of the tank, Churchill being one of them. It was expected that we would be building tens of thousands of tanks, literally, and we would just roll over and onto Berlin on one day when they attacked. And this gave the game away. The tanks were not ready, and they will not be ready again at Bullecourt, as I'm sure you'll get round to covering Bullecourt. And they were not ready at Bullecourt either. And so the tanks, great development, but it gave the Germans an opportunity to counter tanks because of what went on here. And they are a very famous landscape. Most of the illustrations, including the diorama at the War Memorial, depict a knocked-out tank. The Australians digging in trenches with knocked-out tanks around them. So they are part of the landscape here.
I like how you answered that question, Pete, because in my research that I've done, I agree that the Somme campaign, it's one of the key campaigns of the First World War, and it had to be fought.
Yeah, it did indeed. Perhaps I should also mention, I almost forgot him, and I'd scribbled a couple of notes that I meant to talk about. Perhaps one of the more famous and colourful Australian characters is a chap called Harry Murray, who was at this point, I think he's a captain. I'm fairly certain he's a captain, but of course he was awarded the VC here. So during this period of all of this kind of fighting to keep the high ground and to hold the high ground, it was here that he was awarded his VC, and because he will become the most highly decorated Australian soldier of the First World War.
I think he's the Empire. I'm pretty sure
he is.
It was the Empire troop. Yeah,
because there is some debate about that, because it depends on how you see it. Because of course, a couple of people got 2 VCs. So does a 2 VC trump his awards? But I think he is. I think there is some debate. He may be the most highly decorated soldier of the Empire for the First World War. And of course, he was awarded his Victoria Cross here. So so some of the actions that took place here are also important and famous.
Absolutely. So Pete, for you, who you get, like, you're a battlefield guide and you get a lot of Australians come over to visit the battlefields. What are the main reasons that they share with you? What are the main reasons that they come over and visit the battlefields?
Yep, it's a good question, and I just have to think a minute just to answer it. Make sure I give a kind of a good answer, because I could say lots. There's lots of reasons. I would just say the average coach that I'm involved with, that I'm guiding, and I always start off with a chat with everybody. It's one of the things that I enjoy doing. I start at the back of the coach and I work my way to the front as we're travelling normally from Paris to the battlefields, and talk to everybody to actually ascertain that exact question: is why are they here and what interests them? And so it's a real mix. It's military men sometimes who have made a hobby of exploring the battlefields, and so they're here as part of a bigger European or world trip, and they just want to. They've managed to con their wives into allowing them to go on the battlefield tour. It normally means shopping in Paris as a trade-off. I have a lot of people who have relatives here who want to physically walk in the footsteps as much as we can of a relative. I occasionally get servicemen. Not so common now that the bulk of the Australian forces are not fighting in Afghanistan any longer. We used to get quite a few soldiers who would take a busman's holiday on their leave in the middle of their tour of Afghanistan and come onto the battlefields as well. So I've taken many special forces, Australian special forces personnel around the battlefields as well. But I would say that most of the people. Of course, it's the rise of the internet and the rise of what we're doing now of the availability of people to talk to each other and to look at records. And of course, Australia is so famous for having its records all available online. And it's people fishing in, looking at, through the records and thinking, we've got a great uncle who fought there. And I think it's also, you'd have to say, the changing view in Australia that the be-all and end-all is not Gallipoli. Because for a long time, it was, that was Australia's war the First World War was seen as Gallipoli. And it is, you'd have to say, it's a sideshow compared to the Australian numbers involved on the Western Front and the casualties of the Western Front. This is where Australia should have always been coming, is to the Western Front. But Gallipoli, for many reasons, had always drawn the eye of Australia. And I often say that the eye of Australia has slowly moved. It's now, I think, very firmly on the Western Front. It's not gone off Gallipoli, but it's certainly they are now looking at the Western Front. So so it's people, some who are here because they are just interested, because they perhaps have been to Gallipoli in the past and feel now that this is the right time to come and have a look at the Western Front, to see the other part of the story. So it's a mix, I think, of reasons. I enjoy the people who have relatives and we're following in their footsteps as part of the tour, because I think it enhances the tour for everybody. If we, because I always get them to tell their stories so that the whole coach can hear why they are here if they're following a relative. And so I think that's always very moving, and it enhances the story if we have a couple of people, and we always do. There are always at least 2 or 3 on the coach who are following in the relative's footsteps. But I think there's a general interest as well. So many reasons.
You couldn't have answered that any better if you tried, Pete. That was brilliant. It was I agree. It's the real emotional aspect that brings it across and really hits home. And so for people who go over and do the tour with you, what's the common reaction when you're when you're describing the battle and then you move into a cemetery? What is the common reaction for people if they've got a relative in that cemetery and fought and tragically died? What's the most of the reactions that you get?
I think it depends on whether they've been before. Some have been, and perhaps have been on a private kind of visit themselves, but not really understood quite what they were doing and what they were looking at. I think it depends on, sometimes, I know it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes it's the mood of the group sometimes that can affect people. Now, one of the things I should say is, how do I feel about when I'm doing this sometimes? And the interesting thing is, and I suspect that I would stop doing this if I didn't feel like this. I can get very moved myself and find it quite difficult to talk sometimes. And I have to kind of turn on and do just a little walk over there for a minute while I pull myself back together again. Because it's very difficult not to, especially if you're with a family who are obviously moved as well. And I think that can affect a whole coach. And so I think it's very often sometimes the feeling on the coach that means that people can be very, very, very moved by what's going on. But certainly individuals sometimes very moved. But you do find that if somebody, same as ever really, if somebody sets off and starts getting upset or starts to tell a story, and it can affect the strangest of people. I remember an Australian still serving lieutenant colonel, and this was on the centenary of the fighting upon the Hindenburg line. And no, it wasn't the centenary. Forgive me. It was not that it matters really, but it was the 90th. And we decided we all wanted to do a little piece, talk to everybody, and there was a small group. There was probably about 15. And we went round in a circle, and we were all a little to talk about what we'd taken out of it. And the first 3 people couldn't speak because they'd got so emotional. And it went on to the next one, then the next one, and I thought, oh, blimey. And so I said, I'll start. So I did my little piece, and then we started again. And that's when you realise that it is, for a lot of people that come here, even for those that don't have relatives, it can be a very moving occasion. And it's not always just the people that have the relatives that become very moved. From a point of view of a guide, if you're getting people upset, do I think, oh, my job is done? If I've got everybody babble in heaps, then no, I don't. I actually, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, because it can be almost overwhelming sometimes, and it makes it quite difficult to continue. And I do have that occasionally. I have people that I have to take aside and kind of talk to quietly while they kind of get because it means so much to them, especially people who have not been before and have perhaps spent half their lives knowing about these people. They've looked at their photos on the mantelpiece, they inherited the picture of great Uncle Fred or whatever, and they know a lot about him. They've perhaps done a lot of research. They remember mother talking about him, or and then or grandmother, and so to then suddenly be standing in front of his grave can be overwhelming, sometimes for some people. And so so you have to be prepared, or I have to be prepared for all sorts of anger. Occasionally, you do get people that are angry just occasionally, really angry. Why was he taken from our family at such a young age? He shouldn't. I should have met him in his later life. So you get all sorts of different reactions from people. So it's something that I'm very mindful of, and to a certain extent I enjoy, and I think the group enjoys it. When you have those kind of reactions, it brings it home that it's not just about well, I do get the odd few that I often wonder why they were on the tour, because they're not that interested. And there is an element of, I don't get it very often, but it can be a tick box. My neighbours went on this tour, and they're not that interested, but they want to go. I like to think that if they have arrived for that reason, then I will change their opinion by the end of the tour. That they will not be viewing it as a tick box. It's something that's essential, and they will then spread the word that people need to visit the Western. So so I think it's I think it's one of the more enjoyable aspects is people's reactions helps enhance the experience, really.
We should mention too, Pete, that for some people that go on the tours with you or with other battlefield guides, for them, like, they're the first in 5 generations that have visited the grave, and you see with a certain amount of people that they are the first in their family in more than 100 years to visit the grave.
It's perhaps more common than you would imagine. I would say that a good 80% of the clients who have relatives who have lost their lives on the Western Front, they will be the first relatives to have visited. Sometimes 2 or 3 generations. Well, no, always at least 2 generations, but sometimes 3, and sometimes more nowadays. The younger people tend to be they're 4 generations. So it's extraordinary. It's taken that long. Well, it's not extraordinary. That's why I'm saying that. It's money, isn't it? It was expensive at the time, and it still is expensive. It's just that we are more affluent people now, and a lot more people can afford it. But it is, for a lot of people, it's still out of their reach, and that's why these things like these podcasts help for people that can't afford it, at the moment, and hopefully may do in the future. To know a little bit.
Absolutely, Pete. And another thing that I would touch on is the distance. The distance, how far away it is to get to the battlefields. It's not just a 5-minute trip. It's a long way to go to get to the battlefield.
Correct. And again, that's why people do get so emotional. They realise that this is the only time that they're going to do it. I'll just tell you a little private story again. It happens to be New Zealanders in this case. I had a young New Zealand couple who had been on a work visa in the UK, and they had a relative in the cemetery here. We have a little cemetery in the village called Bulls Road Cemetery. It's full of Australians and New Zealanders. And their relative, a great uncle, it'd be a great uncle for them, was buried here. They spent their last day before they were going to get their flights back to New Zealand at his grave. He meant that much to them, and they were the first, and they reckon will probably be the last for a long time from their family who came to visit his grave, and they spent the last day of their visit here. They were staying here with me. I have a little letting sheet here, and they spent the last day sitting and picnicking in the cemetery by his grave, and it just shows how much it means to some people that coming here and visiting relatives who fought in.
Absolutely, Pete. Absolutely, and you would say, and we both agree that of all the nations that fought, the New Zealanders, they came the furthest. They really did come.
The utmost ends of the earth, emblazoned on their memorials here.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So just to sum up, Pete, so why is Flers significant to both sides of the line, so the Germans and the Allies?
I'm not sure it is. It's an interesting, and I think that's why it's really forgotten. It's significant in the sense of the terrible winter, of facing that terrible winter. It's significant in the sense that these are the positions that the Germans will fall back from. So I suppose that's its significance. These are the winter lines that the Germans will give up. They will voluntarily give up these positions, having the Australians trying twice to take them, and they will eventually just be abandoned. And it was an Australian patrol in no man's land who crept right up to the German wire and looked over and thought, excuse the language, there's no bugger here. There's nobody here. No, and so the Germans had slipped away and had started falling back to the Hindenburg line. So that is important. And that's why it's kind of forgotten. It's the forgotten line. It's the forgotten minor actions here, the straightening the line operations, the enormous casualties, but they're spread over the whole of that winter. So they're not kind of concentrated into one battle. It's ongoing casualties from trench foot, casualties from sniping, casualties from mortaring and shelling. And it's that just gritting your teeth and getting on with it. That's really what we're remembering here. It's not really the big actions, because there is no big action. It's holding this front line, gritting your teeth, getting on with it, and learning a bit more about your trade on the Western Front. For those that have arrived from Gallipoli, because we forget about that. There's a lot of Gallipoli men here. Who would have experienced that terrible winter in Gallipoli. So this would be their second experience of a fairly horrific winter. But so there is no great memory, I suppose, other than I was there. I experienced that mud of Flers and Gerdecourt. Other names, Aircore, Abbey, Labarque. These are all names that are associated with this Butte de Wallencourt, names that Australians who were here would remember. So Yeah, and that's what it is really. That's why it's important it is remembered, because of those conditions that they had to face.
Absolutely.
And I truly believe, for most of them, it is the worst conditions of the war that they will face.
Absolutely, and I think, Pete, the listeners can just tell from what you've spoken about in the last hour. They get a sense. It's like I was there, Pete. And it really has. You can tell. It just must have been absolute pure, just grind and just absolute horror, and just think. And I volunteered to come and stand here and do this.
Yeah, that's it. That is, I think, one of the toughest things, and for a guy that's just volunteered, and of course, a lot of guys arrive during this winter, and this is their first experience, and they must have been thinking, "God, what the hell have I done?"
Yeah,
terrible.
Yeah, it wasn't the big adventure that I was promised when I enlisted.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, Pete, for you at the moment, just for the listeners, what have you? Obviously, you're not guiding at the moment, but what are you working on at the moment, and what have you got coming up?
My garden. I've been doing a lot of work in the garden. No, you're absolutely right. There's very little that we can do as far as gardening is concerned, and I've got it's a shame you can't see listeners, but I'm surrounded by my books. I've got an enormous library here, so it's an opportunity to do some research to enhance the tours. So when we hopefully kick off again later in the year or next year, also I have several books on the back burner. One of which, and they all have been on the back burner for some time. One of which is that what we've just been discussing here, the winter of 1916-17, the conditions, the trench foot, the trenches, the men themselves, and some of the little stories that go with it. So that's come to the fore. So I'm starting to do a little work on that as well. So yeah, plenty to keep me occupied. I've got 2 young children as well, which are kind of at home because they can't go to school either. So it's a bit full on, really. I thought I'd be getting a rest, but I'm not.
So, Pete, if people want to book with you privately, how do they go about getting in contact with you? And obviously, when we can travel again to the battlefields, how do they get in contact with you and book a private tour with you?
Yeah, well, 2 ways. Obviously, I work for Matt Mclachlan, so Matt's site, you can go on one of his tours. But if you wanted a more private tour, if you wanted a one-to-one going around the battlefields, then have a look for Fields of France on battlefield tours online, and you'll find me there. And and we have a little accommodation here. So for those people that want to be totally immersed, they can come and stay in a little letting jeep that we've got, and completely decorated as you'd expect with First World War memorabilia, and then guided around the battlefields. So so whichever.
No, that's great, Pete. I really do appreciate you giving your time and telling us a little bit about a forgotten chapter of the Somme campaign that really should be told.
It is, and that's exactly what it is. I think, and that's what that's why I want to tell that story, because it is forgotten. And the mud, most people instantly, and the soldiers wouldn't have, think of Passchendaele. When you think of mud, you think of people drowning in shell holes, and the horror of Passchendaele. But the soldiers didn't think of it. Yes, it was bad enough at Passchendaele, but this is where the real tough time. The mud here was a different quality of mud. It was a very sticky, horrible, glutinous mud that caused enormous problems in getting men in and out of the front line. And it was cold. 40 years, coldest winter for 40 years. So they remembered this. It's these conditions around this village that they remember.
Yeah, and Pete, I'm glad that we've been able to just have a little bit of a chat about it and remember the men who went before us and sacrificed so much. So, Pete, Thank you very much for giving us your time, and we will get you back on the podcast in the near future. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.